I was happy. This was supposed to be the most important day of my life. I was getting married to a man I loved with all my heart. I believed that we would create the perfect family. That he would be my partner, my friend, my support. That we would overcome difficulties together and share joy together. But I was naive. I didn't know that this was the day my struggle would begin. On the eve of the wedding, it's just a legal formality. Everything was perfect. We were getting ready for the wedding, finishing the final preparations. Then suddenly, my fiancé walked into the room with a folder of documents in his hands. He looked calm and confident. "My love," he smiled, sitting down next to me. "There's one little thing that needs to be done before the wedding." I raised my eyebrows. "What?" He placed the documents in front of me. "This is a marriage contract. Just a formality." My first doubt was this normal? I picked up the folder and began to read. The lines were legally dry, but even without experience, I could tell that none of this was in my favor. "James," I paused on one page. "Does it say that in the event of a divorce, I get nothing?" He smiled as if that were funny. "It's just a standard clause. We're never going to get a divorce, right?" His words sounded so easy, but something inside me clenched in warning. I put the documents aside. "Why this contract? Don't you trust me?" He sighed as if I were a small child who didn't understand anything. "It's just business. My parents insisted. They want everything to be fair." "But it's not fair." I looked at him. "You get everything, and well, you're not marrying me for the money, are you?" These words struck me to the core. I married for love. I didn't think about his finances, about his business. I just wanted to be his wife. He pressured me, and I gave in. I didn't want to fight before the wedding. I didn't want tension to arise between us. I loved him. I wanted to trust him. "It won't change anything." He took my hand. "We will be happy. Do you promise?" "I promise." I sighed deeply. I told myself that this was really just a formality, that he couldn't do that to me, and I signed, not knowing that at that very moment I had started a mechanism that would turn my life upside down. Wedding day, I didn't know the truth yet. I stood in a white dress in front of the altar. I looked at the man I had chosen and believed that this was the happiest day of my life. I had no idea that this day would be the beginning of the greatest test I had ever gone through. Because now I was not a bride. I was a woman in a trap, and I would have to find a way to freedom. I thought that after the wedding, our life would be even better. That now we would finally be a real family, that he would take care of me as much as I took care of him. That we would build our future together. But the reality was different, because he had changed. And very soon I realized that the man I married no longer existed. The first alarm bells. At first, it was little things. Little moments that I didn't take seriously. He became less attentive. He asked me less about how my day was. He spent more time on the phone doing business. He no longer wrote to me from work, was not interested in what I was doing. I thought that this was just a normal transitional stage in marriage. That after the wedding, we would both get used to a new life. But I was wrong. Because this was just the beginning. His words began to change. He used to tell me, "I want you to be happy. I love you the way you are. We do everything together, we are a team." And now his words were different. "Why do you need this nonsense? I pay for everything. Maybe you'll stop spending money on unnecessary things. I don't understand why you even need to work." I felt that I was gradually becoming invisible. That he no longer looked at me with warmth. That for him I was just a part of the interior, not a partner. But I didn't know yet how far it would go. The financial trap. He controls everything. We used to have joint plans. We talked about making decisions together, sharing expenses. But after the wedding, everything changed. "I'll take care of the money," he said one day during breakfast. I raised my head. "What?" He calmly took a sip of his coffee. "Well, you don't really know much about finances. And anyway, why should you worry about it? But we planned." He stopped me with a look. "I'll decide everything." And from that moment on, everything came under his control. Pocket money for my wife. I stopped having access to our accounts. Any purchases went through him. Even ordinary things, clothes, cosmetics, books, I had to coordinate with him. "Why do you need another dress?" He asked one day when I showed him a dress I liked. "I haven't bought anything for a long time," I shrugged. He smiled. "What do you want to buy?" You already have everything. But here's some change for you. He put a bill in front of me. I looked at her, feeling humiliation growing inside me. I was his wife, and he treated me like a child who was given pocket money. What would you do without me? His humiliating words. I couldn't keep quiet. I tried to talk to him, to explain that we were supposed to be equal, that I also wanted to have the right to vote. But he just laughed. Oh, honey, he shook his head as if I had said something funny. You're so sweet. I'm serious, James. And I'm serious. Why do you even need this? I looked at him, not understanding. This is our life together. I also have the right to decide what. What? Do you want to solve business issues? Understand investments? He smiled mockingly. My love, what would you do without me? Those words, they hurt. They seemed to cut me into pieces, because they meant only one thing. He did not see me as an equal. He did not consider me smart enough to have a voice. He simply controlled me, and I understood that if I did not change anything, then soon I would cease to be myself. My internal struggle, I will not be a victim. I did not want to live like this. I did not want to be the one who is simply held back. I knew that I had a brain, talent, abilities. I was not helpless, and I won't let him turn me into a shadow. I made a decision. I needed a plan for my own freedom. I had convinced myself for a long time that it was temporary, that James was simply adjusting to the marriage, that his desire to control his finances was just a consequence of his upbringing, that his arrogance was just a moment of weakness. But one day I realized the terrible truth. He would never change, because everything he did was planned. How I learned the truth was an accidental discovery. It happened by accident. One day I was looking for our tax documents because I needed to apply for health insurance. James was on a business trip, and I decided to find the papers myself. I opened a drawer in his office, and among the stacks of papers, I saw a folder that was painfully familiar to me. A marriage contract. Something made me reread it again. I knew what was written there, but something inside me was screaming, read it again. I pulled out the documents, and this time I read every line. Carefully, coolly, without rose-colored glasses. I realized something I hadn't noticed before. This wasn't just about protecting his money. This was a legal mechanism that made me financially powerless. There were little details I missed when I signed. I had no right to any assets acquired during the marriage. In the event of a divorce, I wouldn't get a cent. All the investments, real estate, even bank accounts, everything was registered exclusively in his name. If I didn't work, he wasn't obligated to support me financially after the divorce. My husband planned for me to be completely dependent on him. What if I wanted to leave? I would be left with nothing. This was no accident. He had planned this before the wedding. My heart was pounding. I felt shock, anger, rage wash over me. He hadn't just changed since the wedding. He had always been like this. He was just waiting for me to become his property. I realized that all those mocking words, the control, the financial isolation were no accident. He knew that if I signed this contract, he would have power over me. He knew that I would have no choice. Because where would I go if everything I had belonged to him? For the first time in a long time, I felt fear. I sat in the office with the contract in my hands and felt a chill run down my spine. I was trapped. He thought I would never get out. But he didn't really know me. I wasn't a woman who would give in. I wasn't weak. And I definitely wasn't his property. My decision was that I wouldn't be his victim. I put the papers back in the drawer. But this time, when I closed the drawer, I was closing another part of myself. The part that still believed in him. I was no longer his trusting wife. Now I was a woman preparing to fight. I didn't know how yet, but I was determined to find a way to freedom. I was no longer the woman who blindly believed in my husband. He thought he had trapped me, that I would never be able to escape. But he didn't know that I had started playing his own game, and that now I would never let him control me. The secret plan. I am taking action. I understood that I could not act openly. If he suspected that I wanted to escape, he would start controlling me even more. So I began to build my new life, carefully, step by step. I had to find a way to become financially independent, because without it, I would never be able to escape. Finding a job, he must not find out. I knew that I needed a job, but it was not that easy. James kept asking where I was, what I was doing. If he finds out I'm looking for a job, he'll push me even harder. So I was cautious. I found a job posting at a financial services company. They were looking for an assistant analyst. The pay wasn't great, but for me, it wasn't about the money. It was my ticket to freedom. I sent in my resume, and a few days later, I was invited for an interview. The first lie, I'm doing it for myself. I told James the first was going to meet a friend. It was the first lie I told him in our entire marriage, and it felt strange. I'd never hidden anything before, but now I knew I couldn't play by his rules. The interview was my first victory. When I walked into the office, I felt something new. Freedom. I was no longer a wife controlled by my husband. I was a woman fighting for herself. The interviewer was a thoughtful man in his 40s. He looked at my resume. Have you been out of work for a long time? I nodded. Do you have experience? I'm a fast learner, I replied confidently. He smiled. You have something I like more than experience. So what? Your determination. 3 days later I got a call. I got the job. That was the first step. I knew there were many challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my life. My world was changing. I was no longer the woman he controlled. I was working, earning my own money, learning new things. I became independent, and although he didn't know it yet, he was starting to lose me. But while I was taking the first steps towards freedom, his world was starting to fall apart. The first signs of a crisis. He's not so confident anymore. James used to love to brag about his business. His company was involved in investments, and he considered himself a financial genius. You have no idea what big deals I sign, he liked to say. He thought his empire would last forever. But he didn't notice that everything was changing. Problems he didn't see. A new feeling appeared in our house. He became nervous. He was increasingly on the phone, talking to someone in a raised tone. These are temporary difficulties, he said once. In business. I raised my head. He looked at me suspiciously. It's none of your business. He used to love talking about his successes, but now he kept quiet about his problems. That meant only one thing. Everything was much worse than he said. He could no longer control everything. I noticed the little things. He used to not count money. He spent it easily. But now, he started going out to restaurants less. He gave up a few expensive trips. His phone conversations became more aggressive. His business was declining. And although he didn't say it out loud, I saw fear in his eyes. He didn't know he would soon have to look for a job. His pride wouldn't let him admit that he was losing the company. He still acted like he was in control. But I knew the truth, because there were rumors going around in my company. Rumors that my husband's company was on the verge of bankruptcy. The irony was that he didn't know that I was already working in an industry where his problems were known. That I now had access to information that he hadn't given me. He had always thought of me as unimportant, but now I knew more than he thought. And one day he would face reality, and it would destroy him. I always thought that a career was something that was for other women, not me. That I was made for a family, for the support of my husband, for the comfort of home. At least, that's what he convinced me. But now I had a taste of something new. A taste of freedom. I was no longer just an assistant. I worked day and night. I studied everything I could. I was the first to arrive and the last to leave. And management noticed me. Chloe, my boss said one day, you do a better job than some of the senior staff. I was embarrassed. Thank you. That's not just a compliment. We have a financial analyst position open. Do you want to try it? I almost dropped the pen. Really? He nodded. You deserve it. For the first time, I realized that I was being valued. Not for my looks, not for my marital status, but for my brains, my talent, my work. I got a promotion. It changed everything. A few weeks later, I was sitting in a different office. A sign with my name on the door. A high salary. A new level of confidence. My new reality. But most importantly, now I was no longer dependent on my husband. James began to notice the changes. He didn't like it. At first, he didn't pay attention. But then he suspected something. Why are you coming home so late? He asked one evening. I was exhausted after work. Work? I thought it was just a temporary hobby. No, James. It's a career. He narrowed his eyes. Why do you need a career when you have me? I almost laughed. Do you really think that? His confidence began to crumble. Because now I was not the woman he could control. I was no longer afraid. That scared him. I could see him changing. He began to follow me. He asked me what I did. He tried to make me give up my job, but I no longer obeyed. James, I looked into his eyes one evening. I am no longer the girl you could control. He was furious. Did you forget that you signed a marriage contract? I smiled. So what? His confidence was shattered. Because he understood. I am no longer afraid. He couldn't accept that I had changed. That I no longer depended on him. That I had become self-sufficient, strong, confident. He felt he was losing control. And so he made his last attempt to force me to submit. But he didn't know that this attempt would be his biggest mistake. His anger, he could no longer control me. It all started one evening. I came home from work later than usual. Opening the door, I saw him in the kitchen. He was sitting with a glass of whiskey. His eyes were dark with anger. Finally I came. I took off my heels and looked at him. What's wrong? He took a sip of alcohol and threw the glass on the table. What's wrong? Are you serious? He wanted me to be comfortable for him again. James, stop it. I'm tired. Tired? How do you think I feel? I sighed. And how? You're not a wife anymore. You're acting like some career woman who forgot that her place is at home. I snapped my head up. My place is where I want to be. He grinned. Did you ever think about me? Did you ever think about me when you made me sign that contract? I saw his face twitch for a moment. He hadn't expected this. His manipulation was his last chance to keep me. I just wanted to protect my finances, he muttered. You wanted to disenfranchise me. That's not true. Then why is all the money in your account? Why is all the property in your name? Why will I get nothing in a divorce? He fell silent, because he had no answer. It doesn't matter, he spoke a minute later. Because you're not leaving. I raised my eyebrows. Why do you think that? He smiled. Because without me you're nothing. A wave of calm rage washed over me. I looked him straight in the eye. No, James. Without me you're nothing. His smile disappeared. His ultimatum was either him or the job. If you don't quit this job, I don't see the point in our marriage, he said coldly. I looked at him, and in that moment, everything became clear. Our marriage had long since ceased to exist. This wasn't a union, it was a deal. A contract in which I was to obey and he was to rule. I sighed. Okay. He nodded smugly. Finally, you. I'm filing for divorce. A shock he hadn't expected. What? You said yourself that you didn't see the point in marriage. Me either. You're kidding. No. He stood up. You can't just leave like that. I smiled. You told me yourself. I have nothing. He couldn't find anything to say. Because for the first time in my life, I made a choice without his permission. I was leaving a house that was no longer mine. I wasn't taking anything with me except my belongings. I had no money, no real estate, not even legal title to the property. But there was something more important. Freedom. His final attempts to stop me. He stood by the door, clenching his fists. Chloe, let's talk. I didn't even look back. We've already said everything. But this is ridiculous, he raised his voice. Do you really want to destroy our family? I finally turned my head. Our family was destroyed when you gave me that contract. He opened his mouth, but said nothing. Because he knew it was true. The divorce process, he thought I would beg. He was sure I would break. That when the legal wrangling started, I would realize I wasn't getting anything. That I would crawl back, because I wouldn't have a choice. He even smiled at the first hearing. How are you doing without me? He asked with a sneer. I just smiled. Great. His smug smile disappeared, because he realized I wasn't afraid anymore. The last straw was when he realized he had lost. When the court officially dissolved the marriage, he expected something. He expected me to be devastated. But I just said, goodbye, James. And I never looked back. I started a new life and never depended on a man again. I went back to my job. I focused on myself. For the first time in a long time, I was free. He thought I would die without him. But I was starting to live for the first time. And I didn't even know that very soon it would be his turn to collapse. Because he didn't yet know that fate had prepared a surprise for him. I left the past behind me. I didn't think about James anymore. I was busy with myself, my career, my life. But the world has an ironic way of putting things in their place. Because while I was rising, he was falling. A business that was collapsing. I had heard the rumors. His company was on the verge of bankruptcy. He was making bad investments, losing clients. His former partners were turning their backs on him. James is not the same person he used to be, a colleague of mine once said at work. I just smiled. Really? Inside, I felt no regret. He thought he would always be at the top. He thought he could use people and get away with it. But now he was losing everything. He was left with no money and no status. His acquaintances no longer respected him. His friends no longer wanted to work with him. He had to sell his expensive house. His confidence was gone. But the biggest blow was yet to come. Because he would soon realize that his ex-wife was not the person he remembered. He needed a job, and he submitted his resume. I saw his name in the email. A new resume from a candidate for a financial analyst position at my company. The name, James Montgomery. I took a deep breath, read it again. I couldn't believe it. My ex-husband was now looking for a job, and now he had no choice but to ask me for a chance. His interview was the moment I had been waiting for. I knew there was going to be a candidate meeting. I waited for him to walk into the office, and then the door opened. He walked in, and when he saw me, he froze. His eyes widened. He was shocked. I looked at him calmly. "Sit down, Mr. Montgomery." He was humiliated, but he needed this job. I could see the fear in his eyes. He was devastated. He had been my master before, and now he was sitting in front of me, and he needed me. "Chloe," his voice was weak. "I didn't know you worked here." I tilted my head slightly. "Is that a problem?" He shook his head. No. It's just..." I waited for him to say something, but he couldn't find the words. He sat before me, looking like a man who had just woken up from his own nightmare. His eyes darted around the office, as if he were trying to figure out if this was a joke. But it wasn't. This was a reality he had created. He used to have power, now he didn't decide anything. He used to sit before me like that, but then he was on top and I was on the bottom. Then he decided my fate. Today I was deciding his. I took a deep breath and looked into his eyes. "So, Mr. Montgomery, you're applying for the position of financial analyst at our company." His hands clenched into fists. "Yes." His voice sounded uncertain. "Your resume." I flipped through the papers in front of me, not even reading them. To be honest, it's not very impressive. I looked up. His face paled. He had once looked down on me. Now he was almost pleading. He tried to make excuses. I understand that these are difficult times." "Yes," I nodded. "These must be very difficult times for you." I saw his jaw twitch. "But I'm still qualified." He swallowed the bitterness in his throat. "I can be useful to the company." I tilted my head slightly. "Do you think you deserve a second chance?" He nodded. "Yes." I asked him the same question he had asked me. I took a deep breath. "But, James, I have to ask." He tensed. "Why should I give you this chance?" I saw him turn pale. I repeated the same words he had said to me when he was forcing me to sign the contract. "What can you offer me? How can you be useful?" He opened his mouth, but he couldn't find an answer. Because once he had said this to me with humiliation, and now he was being humiliated. The final blow is my sentence. I endured a pause. He waited. Maybe he thought I would give him a chance, that I would show mercy. But I was not his victim. I was no longer a woman begging for crumbs. I smiled calmly and said, "Sorry, but you are not suitable for us." His face is a complete shock. He froze. He couldn't believe what he had heard. "What?" I shrugged. "You don't have the right qualifications." He licked his dry lips. "But, Chloe." "Oh, did you think your personal connections would make a difference?" I raised my eyebrows. "Unfortunately, in this company we only value professionalism." He realized he had lost everything. He sat in front of me, broken. Once I had been dependent on him. Now he was dependent on me. But I wasn't going to save him. Because he had never saved me. He stood up abruptly. His face was red with anger, humiliation, shame. "You!" "What?" I looked up. He wanted to say something. But then he realized there was no point, because I was no longer his property. He turned and left. He left my office without another word. I watched him go. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes vacant. He had once thought I was nothing without him, but now he was left with nothing. And the worst thing for him was that he knew it now. I no longer felt pain, only pleasure. I expected that when this moment came, I would be shaking with emotion. That anger, resentment, memories of humiliation would wash over me. But instead, I felt only relief. I was no longer afraid. I wasn't holding on to the past. I was simply ending this chapter of my life. The message I had been waiting for. That evening, when I got home, my phone lit up. One new message. I knew who it was from. I opened the screen and saw his name. James. I opened the message. Chloe, I'm sorry. You were right. You were always better than me. I made a mistake. If you can, forgive me. I stared at those words for a long time, and then I deleted the message without even replying. I didn't need his forgiveness. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want him to beg me to come back. I just wanted him out of my life. And this time I didn't look back. I was free. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't anyone's wife. I wasn't someone's property. I was my own mistress. And it was the best feeling in the world. The final scene is my victory. The next morning I put on my favorite suit. For the first time in a long time, I smiled at my reflection. I was no longer the woman who had been humiliated. I was no longer living in someone else's shadow. I got behind the wheel of my new car, and I drove to my job, to my leadership position, to my new life.